Hello people, how you doing? Scotty. So first of all, I want to thank people, of course, for your comments on my recent video on Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as you know, is one of the most controversial political figures, much like the way Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan was.
I'm no communist, I'll tell you that right now. I believe a man should own his own house and car and cow. I like this private ownership, I want to be left alone. Let the government run its business and let me run my own.
So this first comment by Lewis, he says, I don't support him at all because while I don't truly care about the immigration issue but the Muslim immigration, I know he does not know basic economics. Many people are still blaming Reagan for the cause of the 2008 recession because of him lowering corporate taxes and deregulation, even though government has since regulated the economy again after. Well, thank you, Lewis, for your comment, and it's a very interesting point because the way people were blaming Ronald Reagan was the exact same way they were blaming Margaret Thatcher, because you're right, I mean, many people do not understand basic economics. Ronald Reagan did not lower tax rates, he increased the tax rates much like Margaret Thatcher did. They claimed the same thing about Margaret Thatcher. They said that, you know, she lowered the tax rates, she increased the tax rates. Another thing they claim is that, you know, Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan caused the banking crisis. They both say that. They say that for, you know, either one of them, and they say they deregulated the economy and it caused the banking crisis, which is complete and utter nonsense to say the least. You could look at countries such as, for example, Denmark, or Sweden is a perfect example. Sweden's most successful economic time period was between 1870 to 1960. They became the fourth richest nation per capita GDP. And most importantly about Sweden is the fact that at that time period, under a strong free market, they had extremely low levels of government regulation. Leading into the 1960s, 1970s, the 1980s, they led into an economic crisis by the beginning of the 90s, and that was because of the strong government regulation, the failure to let failing industry fail, and it led to the legally protected fraud. Now, a country even like Denmark, well, much like Denmark, Sweden had deregulated and began privatisation by 1993, and the economy started to fare better off. So a country such as Denmark, or, you know, Sweden, Denmark's a perfect example. It has extremely low levels of government regulation, yet did, you know, Denmark face any problem during 2008? Of course they never. As John B. says, the centrepiece of the movement surrounding Trump is immigration. It is the defining issue that surpasses all other issues in the campaign. No other candidate can properly address the issue of US immigration than Donald Trump, because he is largely self-funded. He is not beholden to any deep pocket donors who are greatly vested in illegal immigration. Donor money is the reason why the other candidates in both parties cannot be honest with the voters on immigration. The positions on amnesty and the border are bought and paid for by the donors. That is not the case with Donald Trump. So I can understand your whole issue on to do with immigration, John, and it's vitally important. But again, it's one of these things that I'm sceptical of him. Is he someone who supports the big welfare state? Is he someone who supports, you know, the universal healthcare? Is he one of these neo-conservatives that basically pretends to be a conservative? He's just a liberal in sheep's clothing, pretending to be a conservative where he will support the big war intervention? I'm not entirely sure, because, you know, I've seen him speaking about war before, and that's not the answer. It really is not the answer, and that's just causing an even bigger problem. And that's why I'm sceptical of him on that very issue. So, whilst I do support the controlled immigration as a temporary measure, the real answer to the problem is, because governments caused the major issue, it funded ISIS. It's the one that caused the issue to do with the war intervention, and garnered a lot of hate from that. And therefore we are being targeted over this issue. At the end of the day, the most important thing is to roll back the welfare state, to end all of these wars, and having a controlled immigration for that period of time is sensible. but I would like to see over a period of time when things begin to quieten down over a longer haul, then of course moving towards free flow immigration. But that could only work, as someone had rightly pointed out, under a free market economy. It would not work under the big war intervention, type of, economy, the big corporatist state and the big welfare state and everything. As I'm Triggered says, even if we gave the free market less welfare, no NHS, etc., we still can't have open borders because we need to stop the Islamisation of the West, because look at places like Bradford, Sweden, France, etc. The actual issue is the fact that under the free market, basically it's more peaceful. And when have you ever seen a free market going to war? That's the whole issue. I agree that because of war intervention by government, then of course it's caused a problem, and that's why I say over the longer haul, then protectionism of immigration is something sensible. But with that being said, rolling away from that and moving towards free flow immigration is not so much of an issue, especially when you have gun ownership. If you have gun ownership and the rights of individuals to protect themselves in society, you are giving the people the right to defend themselves against any threat such as that. At the current moment, because you live under the whole welfare status society, where government's your big nanny state and the government's there to protect you, this is the very reason why you see the issues such as what happened in Paris. Of course, the other terrorist attacks as well. And there was an interesting article. They were speaking about how in Germany or in Europe they would bring about gun ownership. And again, I did touch upon that before. So the next comment is again by I'm Triggered. He says, also, surely we need a balance of free trade and some protectionism, because we'll lose so many jobs to China, India, etc. because they are cheap. I don't think people understand that if we move towards a free market economy, we would be able to drastically decrease the costs of living and of course the costs of our produce by becoming a strongly manufacturing country. Because China has been a manufacturing country for so long, Britain hasn't. You couldn't say the United States has. We became more consumerist. So how do you solve that issue? Well, you solve the issue by driving the economy towards a free market. That's how you become a strongly manufacturing country. That's how you become a country that produces more. And the more you produce, the more the cost of goods and services drive down. Therefore, it's then the other countries that become reliant upon you. So it's, in other words, it's the free market that actually solves that problem. Errol says, my main gripe with him is his advocation of tariffs and all-round anti-free trade rhetoric. But yeah, I agree. Free market talk doesn't win elections. Example, Ron Paul's limited success. I think war is less likely under him than Hillary, though. If you spoke free market economics, there's no way you would win elections and stuff like that. But it is kind of worrying with if he is someone who does support stuff like all these protectionist tariffs and stuff like that. That's the type of stuff that leads to war. It's the protectionist tariffs that's actually the main problem. And this idea that, and I'm sorry to say this, but for anyone to bang off about China, they clearly don't understand what the free market would do. If the United States moved towards a free market economy, then of course the United States of America immediately would become a strongly manufacturing country, one that would vastly produce goods and services that would be exported. And in real fact, it would actually be so many countries across the world that would become so dependent upon the United States that it wouldn't even have to worry about China. As Acoustics basically says, Trump is fantastic and is the single biggest blow against the New World Order globalists after Brexit. Support Trump, support the right. They like him because the fact they view him as someone who's very much anti-globalist, standing against the establishment, and therefore, you do have to question, is he someone who is all talk just to get the vote, to gain the support? Is this all a show? And if he's all that talk with regards to the anti-establishment and anti-globalism and all the rest of this, you do have to question, why on earth do you then have the issue over all this, protectionism? Maybe it's just incompetence, maybe it's just all promises, maybe it's all temporary. I don't know what to make of him because he's such a mixed individual. On one side of him, he seems he could potentially be a neoconservative, but then on the other side of him, you could say he's someone who speaks all the rhetoric about being anti-globalist, and so it's hard to say, and that's why I kind of sit on the fence with him. As Anon had pointed out, he said, and to immigration, we really need to get our borders under control. We closed the doors to immigration in 1924. Incidentally, the percentage of foreign-born citizens was about the same percentage as we have presently in the USA. They remained closed until 1965 when Lyndon Johnson and Teddy Kennedy opened the immigration floodgates. We haven't been able to close that door ever since. How and whys of that could result in another several page post. Suffice it to say that Reagan should have never trusted the same Ted Kennedy in granting amnesty in exchange for closing the borders. The illegals were granted amnesty, the border closing never happened. We've literally taken in a quarter of the Mexican population in the past 50 years. Enough is enough. And there is nothing wrong, ethically or legally, denying entry to people based on their religion. Equal application and protection of the law only applies to American citizens. We denied entry to Muslims before. Oddly enough, one of the times this did happen was during the Jimmy Carter administration. Not many know that when the US Navy was founded, their first job was to shatter the power of the Muslim Barbary pirates. So Annan, I do thank yourself for that comment. It's a very interesting point. I don't know too much about the history on the issue to do with immigration in the United States. As you pointed out, something to do with the fact that it ended in 1965, I'm pretty sure you said. And of course, they had the free flow immigration. There's been the issue where you weren't able to control it since then. And you did say enough is enough, as you've taken in about a quarter of the Mexican population within the past 50 years. You know something, I mean, the United States hasn't had a free market since prior to the 1860s, way back, like, as you know, back in the period of the first industrial revolution in the United States. For those of you who don't understand, the American Industrial Revolution began in about 1795, around about that period, and it ended in around 1850. So that was around about the first Industrial Revolution. So it was before, the 1860s that the United States had a free market. And if you had something like a free market, you wouldn't have such the issue to do with immigration, and you would have the strong protection of the people through gun ownership and things like that. At the moment, the reason why immigration is such a massive problem is because the fact that you have this big welfare state and this big nanny state government, and therefore it entices all these type of people to come flooding into your country, and that's what they come for. They leave places like Mexico, they leave poverty behind to go and live in a country where they believe they're going to get this, that and the next thing. Oh, free education, free health, it's all that rhetoric. They get free this and free this, that, and free this, that and the next thing, and that's the reason why they're flooding in. If you took away the welfare state, if you took away all of that and gave the American people their individual liberty in a free market and the right to bear arms and protect themselves, which they do in a certain number of places, and you had a free market, it wouldn't be the issue of what you're seeing today. So as Carlos David points out, he says, your haters on the left are going to be stunned by this one. Honest and well argued as always. I think many times they can be very shocked by me. I think they would be surprised by some of the things I would say. I mean, they would expect me to be someone who's a strong supporter of Donald Trump, and I think that might shock people when I come out and say that I'm not really that big of a fan of Donald Trump. In fact, I'm very sceptical to the point that you could probably put Donald Trump down. Believe it or not, you could probably put Donald Trump down as someone who could potentially be someone who is very much nationalist, socialist. Now, this isn't me that's coming out and saying this. This is the likes of, Jeffrey Tucker from, of course, the Mises Institute. Of course, defenders of the free market who are coming out and saying he's very much nationalist, socialist with regards to things to do with anti-free trade. Now, I can understand that, and that's why I'm very sceptical myself of someone like Donald Trump, and therefore I'm not really his biggest fan. So the next comment is by DNF. He says, Tusk, I'ma repeat some media bullshit here without researching whether it's true or not. Add a post hoc stipulation that I don't know if it's true, but treat it if it was true. Nice. Also, you free trade ideologues crack me up. It all sums up to let's just hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way. What you suppose happens when you got two countries with similar economic power, of which one is fiercely corporatist or even communist, and the other one goes with pure free trade policies, and do consider strategic resources and heavy industry. State economics goes a wee bit above toasters and shoes. It's one of these things that he doesn't really seem to understand, that if you had one country that was strongly for the free market and had free trade, all you would see is that country flourishing and prospering, and the other country that's just communist is just problematic. Now, the country that's communist, that is problematic, is not going to be a country that's going to thrive and prosper. The reason why the Soviet Union lasted as long as it did was simply because it was being funded by the West. That's why it lasted as long as it did. In fact, as the argument and my friend had rightly pointed out, during the Cold War, if America had left it be, if America didn't bother intervening in all of this nonsense, if America just let things be and let the Soviet Union be, the Soviet Union would have eventually have collapsed anyway. They wouldn't have needed to have done anything. So this is what I mean. I'm strongly opposed to all the war intervention, and war does not solve the problem. The only time war is absolutely necessary is if one country does invade your country or attempts to attack you. Then of course you have the right to defend yourself as a country in war. That's when I believe it is absolutely necessary. So here's the issue. You're talking about how free trade ideologues, I don't understand that, because in recorded history we've seen free trade in many places. In fact, it was one of the main reasons why a country, or shall I say a city like Hong Kong, had thrived and prospered. It was no different to a city like Singapore. And of course we've seen free trade in Britain between 1843 and it ended in 1913. Britain had thrived and prospered, it had flourished in that time period. Now, do you see a country such as Switzerland going to war? Do you see any free market country going to war? Of course you don't. You don't see that issue with them. You don't see any war intervention with them. That's because governments always were the initial problem to begin with. Governments were the ones that funded ISIS. Governments were the ones who were behind funding, let's just say, the banking corporate elite and giving them the power. And what have they done? They've been funding both sides of every war you could just about name ever since dating back to the Battle of Waterloo. That really just goes to say something. But this is what I don't understand, how someone can possibly say that it's something ideologic to support free trade. Yet this is what gets me, because the opposite of free trade was precisely what caused all the wars to begin with. That's right, it was the protectionist tariffs, the very things that the likes of Donald Trump are supporting. That's what precisely caused war throughout recorded history. Why? Because what you're doing is you're laying down a tariff, a protectionist tariff, preventing another country from freely trading with your own country. That's what you're doing. And by doing so, you're hindering the growth of the other nation. That's what you're doing. You're hurting their business. That's not a way of how you make the world a better place. It's not about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It's about reality. How you better improve the living standards and improve the relation between countries is through trade. Not the opposite way around. That's not what caused problems. What caused problems was precisely what you're supporting. In other words, the protectionist tariffs. Again, quite a lengthy comment. As son of Tiamat says, the USA used to have tariffs for a long time, but we mostly stopped using many of them a few decades ago. Even when we were laissez-faire within our own borders, we still had tariffs on imported goods, and those tariffs in turn paid for the functions of government. That's pretty true. I'll continue on with his comment. He says, this was before federal income tax was implemented. You bring up excellent points about tariffs, but personally, I think a little bit of protectionism is sadly necessary sometimes. As he says, even if we don't use protectionism, it won't stop countries like China from using them. And that's the reality of how the world is. We're still a world of competing nation states. And it's only natural for some countries to put their nation as a whole first. I think we need to lower taxes on businesses, obviously, but also use tariffs to de-incentivise them from outsourcing their labour. I guess what I'm for is a mix of capitalism and mercantilism. Not aggressive mercantilism, just enough to put the nation on equal footing with other nations. That way, future trade deals could be arranged that would benefit both parties equally. What the free market would do is it would give the United States the opportunity to basically freely mass produce goods and services. The opportunity in business, the opportunity in employment would be vast. The employment rate would shoot through the roof. The United States of America would be flourishing. Their manufacturing would be vast. So many countries across the entire world become so dependent upon the United States. The reason for why the United States is facing trouble with the likes of China today is because it's anti-free market. It's because the fact that the current problems that it's facing today is the very fact that it does have things like the big welfare status, etc., as I've explained before. China's not going to be much of an issue if the United States turns towards a free market. And that is reality. Hong Kong did not thrive and prosper because of China. It didn't need it. It didn't need, Hong Kong didn't need, or Singapore, it didn't need China. In fact, you would find that China was far worse off than the likes of Singapore and Hong Kong. Hong Kong and the likes of Singapore, they were thriving and prospering during a time when the likes of China was strongly economically communist. Hong Kong had practically no natural resources. How is it going to be much of an issue for a country like the United States of America under a free market? How is it going to be much of an issue with the likes of China and losing jobs? It wouldn't. And the reason why they wouldn't lose jobs is because the vast opportunity to create business in the free market, that's where investors go. Investors will go where they can freely do business. Investors love free markets. In fact, investors would turn away from China and flood over to the United States if it turned towards a free market. Investors would go wherever there's strong free trade in business and free exchange. That's where they would go. So the United States would have no trouble because they would be able to mass produce through, manufacturing, and other nations would become so heavily dependent upon them and the purchasing power of their monetary value. If the likes of the United States turned towards a gold standard or something, by Christ, the United States would wipe the floor with these other countries. So again, everyone, thank you for your comments. I greatly appreciate your time. And of course, if you have any further comments, comment below and I'll be sure to get back to you on those things. So, it's been interesting and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.